we're now living in, we are competing in, we are repeating in, we are believing in. It's time for us to shift our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.
Hello and welcome to Fundamental Assumptions, a new episode on how we look at the world and how we can change our perception. And by that we also, if our perception creates the world, then we also change the world. My name is Stella Nordahl, and I will be hosting this little event together with you who are listening in, and hopefully we will get some new ideas on how we can look at the world, how we can look at us as persons and us as human beings. And of course, part of this is about how we interact with the world, but also how we look at ourselves. So by changing that perception, hopefully we can change how the world is created. So the next coming 40 minutes, I will give some ideas on how we can take an assumption we have today and hopefully change it to another one. And that could be by an insight, it could be by a mistake, and it can also be intentionally. And the idea here is to present some kind of alternative to the predominant assumption that we have built the society with, or our organizations or whatever. So for giving an example, I would like to start with something which I believe is very predominant in most organizations, and that is the structure itself. So what we have seen during the last 150 years or something, what can I say, connected to efficiency and so on, we have seen hierarchical structures, hierarchical organizations, and more or less we believe that an efficient organization requires this structure. So we have a strong leader, or a strong, what can I call it? A strong belief in some specific person. Very often we can call it a boss, or we call it a president, or we call it whatever we call it. We put one person in front or on top. It could be a CEO, it could be a president, as I mentioned, or almost any person that we either we elect them or they take the power themselves. When you're starting a business, for instance, very often the person or persons that are funding the startup also put themselves in the position of taking the decisions, and that could be efficient for some organizations. But is it efficient in a long-term perspective? For instance, what happens if we truly, if we believe that this person under any circumstance take the right decisions? That is actually what we have done with a hierarchical structure, because the person that we have put in charge is the person that is taking those final decisions, or have the veto, or whatever we call it. So how can we look at an organization? Are there any other ideas that can be introduced? And are there any goods coming out, any good things coming out of having an hierarchical structure? Of course, there are plenty of hierarchies in life. Some of them are based on organizational and relational issues, and I believe those are, I really believe those are good structures. But if we have it as a power structure, and that is the only way we can use and influence the power, then we will probably at some point have a problem. For instance, we take decisions in that kind of organizations that is based on the level of consciousness that this specific person have. And what happens then when we are limited to the single person's level of consciousness? One thing is that we totally neglect the collective wisdom or the collective knowledge, the embodied knowledge in an organization, and so on. So it can be efficient, definitely. If we are in an organization or in a need of taking quick decisions, then a single person decision could be what is the difference between life and death. That's very often what happens in war. You have to take a decision, and based upon that, everything that comes after is dependent on that specific decision. But most organization doesn't play on such a playground. We are in an infinite game plan as a society, as a world, but we have based it upon on a finite game plan where there is one answer. So the idea here is to present an alternative idea, and in this specific case, it could be that efficient organizations are held together through a common purpose. So this is an alternative idea on a fundamental assumption. And just to put in some words before we go through this specific fundamental assumption, how can when we change the fundamental assumption, what do I mean by that? So what I think of here is that when we have a fundamental assumption, that is the design criteria for everything we do, the way we live, and the way we look at the world. That means that we can't actually see anything outside this fundamental assumption, and it becomes more or less as a main rule, and everything else are exceptions. So in an purpose-driven or purpose-engaged organization, there can be hierarchical structures, but they are not the same at all time or all specific time points, and it's not that it's the only way to organize. So the idea here is that the organizations are held together through a common purpose. So there is a reason of being, so to speak, a way of interacting with the world, which is a fundament for the whole organization. It could be expressed in words. It could be expressed in a belief. It could be expressed in a value or something that is of importance for those persons. A purpose in the hierarchical structure, which is very often used, is an economical purpose, and that could be of interest if it's like value distribution in that organization. But why would I like to engage in putting money in someone else's pockets? That could be a reason, of course, but most people, I guess, should be more healthy in a world where a common purpose is something that is higher than yourself. So in addition to this fundamental assumption, efficient organizations are held together through a common purpose. In addition to that, one could say it could be of interest to have a common purpose that is of a higher nature. That means something that is beyond ourselves, beyond me as a person, beyond us as a group, and us as an organization. Something that is contributing to a larger and broader perspective. So this is how those fundamental assumptions ideas work, and hopefully you find it interesting. And of course, this is not the only way to look at the world. What we have done here is that we have taken the most common and widespread assumptions that we have in the Western world, and we have presented an alternative, at least one. And the idea is also that the alternative, if that becomes the main rule, then it includes the previous assumption. So here, efficient organizations are held together through a common purpose, and that includes those organizations that, when needed, are organized hierarchical. But an organization that is held together through a common purpose, it's not necessarily organized in a hierarchical structure. It could be a dynamic structure. I've experienced this myself from organizations where it organizes in dynamic structures of cell structures and so on. People come together not only by the common purpose for the whole organization, but for a common goal or a common event or a common customer need or whatever it is. And actually, that is what we do when we have projects. So project groups is a perfect explanation or idea or example of an organization that is held together through a common purpose. So what happens in projects is, for instance, that we gather through a unique time period, a unique project, unique task during a specific time period. And when we do so, we come together by this common purpose. So that's an example which I believe most people in the work life today share at some level at least. So that's an example which I believe many of you can relate to. And again, what would happen if efficient organizations are held together through a common purpose? What would then happen, and what can then happen? And when we answer that question, it doesn't need to have one single answer. It's not that it's one specific answer. It's in the back of the book. It's the only answer, and you're not supposed to peek on it. It's actually the opposite of that, more or less. It can be a lot of different answers, and the answers can also be interpreted from the eye of the beholder. So this is one of the fundamental assumptions here, which are connected to many others. For instance, the observer that is objective. Can you be an objective observer if you share a common purpose? I don't believe so. I believe that as soon as you share a common purpose, you're actually co-creating in that direction, no matter if you're part of that organization or not. So, okay. So that's one example. When we're talking about fundamental assumptions, some of them are not, how shall I say it, accessible from the worldview that I'm in. It's like defining myself from the point where I'm standing. It's very hard to see outside that, we can call it bubble for a while, or outside that worldview. So that's a common problem with all those fundamental assumptions. They become our truths. So fundamental assumptions is a nicer way to say the truths that I have acknowledged and the belief system that I'm in. And of course, that is limiting us, but it's also enabling us. So just to be clear, a fundamental assumption doesn't have to be right or wrong. It could actually be more like, okay, in this context, this is relevant. And in another context, it's not at all relevant. So the idea here is to find assumptions that are relevant for the context and the time we're in. And to relate to another one, this is a related fundamental assumptions. And this is this assumption here is it's about motivation in organizations. And for many years, this which I will present now is a fundamental assumption that has been seen as a truth. It says it's about motivation, though, and then it's an extrinsic motivation. It says bonus programs are important to attract good employees, business leaders, and managers. So my first question is it like that? Is it like that bonus programs are important to attract good employees, business leaders, and managers? Well, at the first glance, I would say, yeah, maybe. Or maybe not. And the interesting thing here is that people that have studied extrinsic motivation, I think Daniel Pink and people like him, they have come up with a conclusion that when you have extrinsic motivation, you should be aware of that it also creates what is called externalities. That is, things that you maybe don't want, or maybe you want them, but you don't see them from the start. It's like a result that is coming it's a result that is created by this extrinsic motivation. And of course it could be of interest to have bonus programs and so on. But what we have seen during the last 10, 20 years or maybe longer is that it's used in contexts where it maybe shouldn't be used. During time periods which are for businesses tougher or harder, and a bonus program then connected to a result could maybe be of interest, but many times there have been connections to bonus programs and so on that a lot of people haven't seen as a good connection, and then it creates an externality, which is that you believe that those leaders or business leaders and managers are looking only into things for themselves, to find a way to maximize your own wealth or whatever it is. So of course that could in itself be a problem. But bonus programs as a specific idea in a specific company at a specific time, it doesn't need to be bad. It could be a good thing. It could be a driver, of course. But as a general rule, I believe we need to find another way to look at it. And what could such another way be then? So this is where it connects to the previous one. And this is something that I believe that the NGOs have seen for many decades, and that is that people are attracted by purpose and meaning. So it's not only that it's efficient to have a common purpose, it's also attractive to have it. And that means that you put yourself into to this organization and you find meaning in it. And when you do so, you also take ownership of this, not only the purpose itself, but also for the results and for the organization as a whole. So this is what we have seen in many organizations that have been created on a common purpose. Let's say the Red Cross or almost any NGO, I would say, have this possibility at least, and also a municipality. Municipality is, if we go to the entity of that specific municipality that is running the whole municipality, it's based upon a purpose. So that's another example. And today, at least for the last decade or something, many companies have tried to find a way to attract people and also other organizations, because it's easier to co-create with other organizations and cooperate with them if they share a common purpose. So it's also a way of finding your customers and finding your partners, and of course this could be done in many other different ways. And how can I say? If we go to ourselves, if I'm in an organization where I find myself and I find my own beliefs or my own values, of course it's easier for me to take more of myself into that organization and maybe bring the whole of myself into that organization. So, but on the other hand, it could be something that could be a problem also if you have a purpose that you find if you connect it, for instance, with the efficiency idea, then it could be really tough for people. You have a purpose, and you give and you give and you give, and you, if you don't receive anything, let's say you not acknowledge the energy it brings back, or money so that you can live on your purpose and your meaning, then there can be a huge problem, because then you're giving away more than you get back, and that system won't last for long. So it's not a solution to all organizations, but I guess that formulating and believing in and working for a common purpose and a higher meaning will be attractive for this intrinsic motivation. Okay, so so far so good. Those are two examples of business assumptions that we have. I suggest here to move outside business, and this is about uncertainty. We have lived in now for more than 2 years in a very uncertain time, and little bit more than 2 years ago, in the spring 2020, we were facing COVID for the first time as a world, and that brought up a lot of negativity and brought up a lot of anxiety and worries and so on. And the fundamental assumption, I believe, from up to that point was that uncertainty and change is negative and should be avoided. There is something that a lot of people hold as a truth. Even if you don't see it, it's very common. And when you then find yourself in a change curve that is accelerating, then what happens then is that you believe that this is really negative and should be avoided. And if we only speak from we can take an example. We can take this Best for the World broadcast as an example. It was actually created in that time period when the uncertainty was at the maximum, and the whole world was in synchronicity, and everyone was worried for what COVID might be and what it might bring and so on, and at some level it was a relevant worry, but at some point it also I would say brought the worst out of of us, and we now see it again when there is a war in Europe, and uncertainty is something that for many people is very negative, and war itself is extremely negative, of course. But what would happen if we can see what can come out of an uncertainty? So uncertainty means actually that things are moving, and in that uncertainty, again going back 2 years to the spring 2020, looking into what have happened during those 2 years, is that we have learned so much new things. And what if uncertainty then is hotbed for development? And what if we can see the change curve as a possibility curve? And this is something that smaller societies that have been, how should I say, they have maybe had a big company in that area which provided a lot of jobs and so on, and at some point that something happened which meant that this organization or business they went out of business more or less. And what we know today is that when that happens, if you have a employer that is maybe having most of the employees in a little smaller village and so on, and what happens is when they leave, there can grow up new things that haven't been there before. So that is quite a common, not that it happens all the time, but it's more common than uncommon, so to speak. And this, I would say, is an effect of this uncertainty's hotbed for development. A lot of things that were rigid and static before comes into motion, and that creates new ways of looking at things. You're more or less pushed into looking at the world with new eyes, and also connect in new ways. And what happens then with us as persons is that we also get new neurons, new ideas, and new relations as human beings. So, what if we can look at the world and see that the change curve can be seen as a possibility curve? That means that when we stand in that specific time of change, we don't need to have the negative side of uncertainty as a first choice, as a reactive choice. We can have development as a first choice, and learning is directly connected to uncertainty in some way. So that was another example of what can be, and what can be seen from another, not only perspective, actually from another perception. And I suggest we will take another assumption and see if we can find some kind of alternative idea. It's not an alternative truth in the worst version of it. It's more like an alternative way to see ourselves and the world. And we very often are told that we should be rational. And a common way of looking at it is that we as people are rational when we take decisions and make actions. You probably have seen the same thing as I've seen, and that is that when we have taken a decision, then we, at least I, very often like to see that it was rational afterwards. So I back rationalize things. And that is, I believe, quite common. And I think that it's because of this assumption that we should be rational in decision making and action taking. And who would like to see yourself as non-rational? That's not so very nice. So the idea here is, what if we are irrational? What if decisions are based on emotions? Of course, sometimes when you have the time to figure out and analyze and so on, you can base your decisions on a rational. But very often we take decisions on in the moment, based on the emotions that we're in. And if we would have this as a fundamental assumption, I would say we would also have the possibility to realize it. That means that if we get aware of it, we can make another choice. So if we know that we're triggered by a certain, maybe certain emotion or a certain situation or a certain context, then if I'm aware of it, I can also change the way I choose to relate to it. Even if we're reactive in the first specific moment, we don't need to be reactive in the second moment. And of course, this is easier to say than to do. I definitely acknowledge that. But there are ways to go from reactive to reflective and to proactive. A very, I would say, simple way, but super effective, is I don't remember the name of this psychologist. It's a woman who came up with a very simple but very powerful, I would say, method to cut the chain of reaction, and that is when you have to, at first you have to be aware that we are irrational and take decisions based on emotions. In the next step, you need to find a way to recognize your triggers or recognize your emotions when they come as a reactive result. If you're able to do that, then the trick is you count backwards from 5 to 1. And that is requiring how can I say it? It requires enough of conscious awareness, or whatever we call it, to break the line or the chain of reaction, and that makes the person in that situation able to take a new decision. So, and this is actually going in opposition to the story we have been told about humans are reactive animals, we have a reptile brain and so on. Because if that would have been true, then we are victims of the circumstances. But I don't believe in that story any longer, because I've seen so many examples and so many people that have been able to take decisions in very awkward moments, in very tough situations, in very, very, very pressed and stressed situations, and they have been able to take intentional decisions that have been based upon something that is more of a how can I say it, life-affirming direction, or attractive direction, or at least non-reactive, maybe more proactive direction, and putting themselves into a creator of possibilities instead of victims of circumstances. So going from victimhood or the victimhoody to a capability cape, and put that on. That's just some words for describing what this could be about. So that was yet another example of how, when we are aware of a fundamental assumption, can make new assumptions of how the world works. The next one is about reality. And reality itself is a very, very, very interesting word, I believe. Let's present the predominant assumption here. And that is that what we see is reality. And we see it as it is. And this is, of course, when you look at the world, it's reasonable. It's a assumption that seems totally reasonable. And what happens if we acknowledge this one then? That makes us, again, victims of the worldview we have. And maybe we can just introduce some questions to get out of this box. How can I also look at the world? Are there more perspectives? What if I put myself in someone else's shoes, and so on? And an idea here is that reality is a representation of something. So it's not, I can't never see the whole. There is, I don't know how to put this, but I would say that if you come to a point where you realize that there is always more to learn and there is always more to see, then you realize that what we see is just a representation of reality, or a fraction of it, or it's not that it's unreal, it's more that the way I look at it also creates the world itself. And that would then mean, for instance, that the world always holds more than I can see. And of course that's not, like, you can take a very simple and very ordinary example here. I guess most people have some kind of experience of this little story, and that is you're about to leave the house and you can't find your keys. And no matter what you do, you can't find them. And at the point where you give up, or maybe in a later stage when you have left your house unlocked and come back, and then all of a sudden they're at the place where you realize that they have been there all the time, and you can't believe that you couldn't see them. And this is just an ordinary day-to-day experience that we all have at some point or at some level. And if we make that a little bit bigger, that means that whatever I see, there is more to see. There is more not only behind it, but around it, and in front of it, and upon it, and in it, and maybe also on layers which are not accessible for me as a human being. So what have been actually, and this is interesting in itself, because now I'm going to contradict myself for a while, and that is to present a proof of something. And the idea here is that a lot of proofs that are presented are creating the reality also. And this is an idea that a guy called Donald Hoffman introduced a couple of years ago, and that is that if you use the idea of when a species develop, we have this this set of resources that both enables and limits that species. And if you say that, okay, one of those resources are conceptual capabilities, they have shown now mathematically and by computing that the probability that we as humans have been given the right set of the right set of conceptual capabilities to describe an objective world, if you go in that direction, the probability for that is 0. So nature never gives more than is needed for a species to navigate in the world or create whatever they are supposed to create. And that for me is also in the direction of this. What we see is only a representation of reality. So I would say this is what I wanted to present today in this episode of Fundamental Assumptions. And I hope you have found it a little bit intriguing, a little bit of inspiring, but also a little bit of maybe it created a little bit insight, or maybe it created an experience or something that makes you, I wouldn't say question because of questioning things, more to be curious. So I hope this have made you a little bit more curious on how we look at the world. And when we look at the world, that is both enabling us as human beings, as organizations, and as society and world, and also limiting us as human beings, organizations, societies, and world. So thank you very much for listening in to this episode. My name is Stella Nordahl, and I hope to see you soon again. Take care. Bye.
We are creating the world we're now living in. We are competing in. We are repeating in. We are our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.